Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the recording of our very first webinar, 6 Steps to Better Horse Pasture Management with Paul Sharpe, author of Horse Pasture Management. This webinar is presented by the Equine Studies Online program at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, home of the Ontario Veterinary School. And it's supported and delivered by Equine Guelph and Open Learning and Educational Support. The Equine Studies program offers 21 online equine science and business courses for the horse owner and enthusiast. We're excited today we welcome Paul Sharpe, who has been a guest speaker in our equine nutrition course and of course has researched and written a pasture management book. He's a retired University of Guelph professor, researcher, and associate director of programs, and considers himself a practical animal scientist. One thing we want to mention before I turn it over to Paul is that this webinar has been recorded. This is a re-recording, so you will not be able to see the live chat and some of the original, but you will see the original content that we presented last week. So with that, I'd like to let you take it away, Paul. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. So the title is 6 Steps to Better Horse Pasture Management. I hope there's at least 6 things you'll be able to remember after we go through this. We will have some pauses so that you can think about some points or questions that we'll pose. I guess you won't be able to benefit from the live chat about anything or see the quick results of polls, but I think we'll provide lots of opportunities for you to think. So the first thing we wanted to get people to think about is what is their current level of experience with pasture? And do you have some alternatives for them to consider, Marjorie?
I do. In a moment, you'll see a poll launch. So just think about where you are in your pasture experience.
Okay, so I can see the possible answers here. I want you to be honest with yourself and think, do you have absolutely no pasture experience? Or have you mowed the lawn? And I think a number of people who may have mowed the lawn regularly might not have thought of it in terms of a pasture as a source of food for an animal. Have you just walked on your pasture to get to a horse? Have you actually moved fences because you were working with someone or a pasture that was doing some management? Or do you have really extensive pasture management experience? And hopefully I'll be able to provide something for people at all levels.
And I think many of the people who will be watching the recording have come from all levels of experience.
Yes, I'm expecting that too. So you've been thinking about your own level of experience with pasture. When we had the live show, I predicted that the middle answer would be the most frequent one, and that turned out to be the case, that most people picked answer number 3, which was that they went out to a pasture to get a horse. And I hope that lots of you will continue to go out to pastures and get a horse, but also have a look around at the pasture while you're there and see what you can observe. So let's get going with the slides. I've asked a question, what's a good pasture? And I'm going to provide some answers to that. First, that I believe a good pasture should provide a high quality life for horses. The University of Guelph has a motto of improving life, and I think that's what we should try and do as we learn more and more about managing our animals on pasture. It should be a good source of feed and water, both in quantities and quality of the feed and water. It should be a comfortable place for the animals, and it should be a healthy place. Also, the amount and type and quality of forages, that is the plants that you see on the pasture, should be both reliable and predictable. Now, when we are dealing with weather, we realize we can't control the reliable as much as we'd like to, but we can certainly predict that, for example, when we get more rain, we'll get more forage. If we get more organic matter in our soils, we'll get more and better quality forage. So here we see a couple of pictures of feed and water issues. In terms of feed and water quality, there are some things that you can learn in a nutrition course about both of those. Another webinar might deal with hay quality, and that also applies to pasture quality. And we'll address some of this as we go along with the slides. But you can see the horses grazing on the left. They have a nice quantity of feed available. It's of a moderate height. We don't see seed heads or flowers on the grass plants, so that's got good quality to it, and there's a reasonable quantity. When we look on the right side, we see a horse drinking from a mobile trough. To me, that's a great invention for pastures that get temporary use. And we can also see that the quantity of pasture in that picture is much less than in the picture on the left. Now, in terms of a comfortable environment, this is a picture of some racehorses undergoing training in England. They need a really comfortable place. Horses who are spending most of their life on pasture also need a comfortable place in terms of what happens to their joints and their hoofs as they're running along a surface. So there should be a certain amount of absorption of shock and a certain amount of cushioning to a pasture surface. It should also be well drained. We don't want wetness accumulating. The soil should have the ability to absorb the rainfall, and there should be some slope and also some openness between the aggregates in the soil so that water can drain away. A source of shelter is another desirable thing on a pasture. Horses certainly have their own ability, like any animal, to seek out a change in environment when they need it. If they get too hot, they can go in shade. If they feel too cold, they should be able to get out of a wind or get out of precipitation falling on them. So on the left, we see a very traditional type shelter for a horse. They can decide when they're going under that shelter or not. And on the right, we see a fairly modern invention. This is a thing called Shade Haven. It's a temporary pasture shelter. It's got wheels there. It can have the top part kind of folded up like an umbrella, and then it can be towed with a four-wheeler to another part of the pasture. This slide shows some things that we don't want much of in the pasture. In the left picture, we see a lot of metal junk, and we don't really want that because probably all of you know that horses are very prone to injury. Picture on the right shows some worms in the manure of a horse, and with good pasture management, we can greatly reduce the worm loads of horses as well. I'm going to be talking about rotational grazing, and by rotating animals out of paddocks so that there's a long lag period before they get back in that paddock, that will help with control of parasites. A pasture should have a relative absence of disease vectors such as mosquitoes and flies. So we see in the pictures on the left a bunch of face flies on a horse, and we see a mosquito close up. And I was wondering how many of you could name a disease or two that is spread by mosquitoes. I don't think we'll actually pause very long for this. If you want to think about it, you can pause your your play button and think about it. So for now, I'll let you know two diseases I'm aware of that mosquitoes can bring to horses, and that's encephalitis, both Western and Eastern equine encephalitis, and West Nile virus. So with our pasture management, we can create conditions that reduce the possibilities of flies and mosquitoes infecting our horses. We want to make sure that pastures don't have high levels of weeds, particularly toxic weeds, such as the one we see on the right, which is called tansy ragwort. Of the herbaceous weeds, that is one of the most toxic ones. So a good pasture should be better than what we see in these two photographs. In the one on the left, I want you to notice that the grass is very short. There are a bunch of tall weeds growing there. Those weeds have had a chance to produce flowers and set seed, and they're being reproduced because horses don't like to eat them. So do you think they're having a high quality of life out there? Is this a good source of feed and water? We can't see where the water is, but my suggestion is, even though this is a common situation, I don't think it's a good source of feed, and those horses don't have a very high quality of life. Now, they do have a chance to get some shelter from some trees, so there's probably a bit of shade, but they're going to have to spend a lot of time grazing to get much to eat off of that pasture. In the picture on the right, I'm assuming this is a drought situation that happened during a growing season, because the forage looks quite high and thick, but it's totally dried out. There's no green chlorophyll left in there. This poor mare has lost a great deal of body condition. You can see her ribs and hip bones. She's got a foal there that she's trying to produce milk for. They need rescuing off that pasture. So to me, that's not a healthy place for them to be, because there's not enough energy and protein in that feed for them. Is it reliable and predictable? Well, I'd say it's predictable that they're not going to get any better nutrition on that feed shortly, so they need another source of feed for sure. Some other things that are features of a good pasture. It should allow animals to get big bites of good forage. Some of the research that's done by animal behaviorists actually measures how big a bite horses can get. And really good quality forage that's of a decent height and it's a good thick stand of forage will allow them somewhere close to 50 grams of dry matter per bite. A good pasture should allow a horse to find and select really good forage species, those that it's familiar with, those that it knows to be desirable. It should be the right maturity, so moderate maturity, not so mature that it's got flowers and seed heads, good flavors that they recognize, nice smell and texture, so it feels good in the mouth. It's not got prickly things like thorns in it or thistles. And it's a place that horses can express their natural behaviors. Their behavior of forming a band or family group that's part of a herd, their ability to groom each other as well as themselves, and the ability to run when they want to. A little bit more about grazing behavior. Horses will often graze from 12 to 16 hours a day if they're out there 24 hours a day. And how many hours they have to spend will depend on their intake rate. If they can take really big bites of good quality forage, they don't need to graze all that many hours. They don't need to take all that many bites. They can take more than 36,000 bites in a day, which is a huge amount of physical activity for their jaw muscles. Now, this point shows that bite size, you see the Greek letter alpha, that's supposed to be stretched out a little bit to mean proportion. So bite size is proportional to 1 over the bite rate, or bite size and bite rate are inversely proportional to each other. So as bite size goes up, the number of bites in a day they have to take goes down. As horses walk along in a pasture, they're sampling different forages as they go. And initially in a day, they're trying to satisfy their protein requirements. And then later on in the day, they might go through the same area again, trying to satisfy their energy needs by selecting slightly different plants to bite from. Different species of animals have different grazing preferences. And we see horses on the left in this table. And going down, we see that they prefer about 90% of their diet to be made up of the forages that are broadly classed as grasses and legumes. They'll willingly take about 4% of their diet as weeds and about 6% as what's called browse or woody material, like parts of shrubs, bushes, and trees. Cattle are a little bit different. While they also do prefer grasses and legumes, they don't have quite the same tendency as horses. They're willing to take more in the way of weeds. Next, looking at sheep, we see that their desire for grasses and legumes drops further. They're more willing to eat some weeds, and cattle and sheep are willing to eat a little bit more browse than horses. And then we come to the very unusual ones, the goats. They're not that fussy about grasses and legumes, but they really like their browse material. And pasture managers can take advantage of these tendencies in order to get their pastures grazed more uniformly.
Paul, I'm just going to jump in for a moment because I know in our live webinar, this idea of combining horses and goats and other animals on a pasture was of interest to the participants. And they did have a few questions about whether you put, for instance, horses and goats on the pasture at the same time, or do you rotate them? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. A good pasture should not be just a single species of plants. It should be quite biologically diverse. And if you ever get to the point of seeding a new pasture, at least 2 legumes and 2 grasses would be a good idea. But often pastures have some weeds and some browse or woody material moving in from the edges as well. And if you get to extremes of some of these things, it is often a good idea to bring in some sheep or goats, possibly cattle. Horses and cattle can get along with each other quite well. Horses can get along with sheep or goats too if they're introduced to each other at a young age. But it can be very beneficial and even more efficient in terms of forage use to occasionally bring in some goats or sheep. And you might think, well, how can I do that? I don't want my own herd of goats or sheep. But often you can deal with neighbors who might have these, and you could rent or sell them some pasture for a short time. So you could take your horses out if they don't get along with the sheep or goats, and bring in some sheep or goats to eat the things that they prefer that your horses probably don't. And then after those sheep or goats are gone and the pasture has regrown, it'll be more uniform when you bring in the horses and they can find the grasses and legumes they like best. I did write a whole chapter in my book, Horse Pasture Management, about mixed species grazing. Most of the research on that has related to cattle, sheep, and goats, but there are some interesting things in there about incorporating horses as well.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Um, Now we'll look at some things on a pasture that can be less than ideal. So this is a pasture in eastern Ontario that has been overgrazed by a mixture of sheep and goats. So yes, sheep and goats can coexist, but doesn't mean that the place will always be well managed. We can see, like in one of the previous pictures, a lot of tall, unpalatable weeds. And in the real foreground, you can see that those are thistles. So this place isn't all that well managed. Um, to me, there's very little good forage there for a horse to eat, or even for the sheep to eat. Although sheep can graze pretty close to the ground, it doesn't mean it's a good situation for the plants or the animals. An animal that would be eating in that last slide would probably be in a situation of overgrazing. And I say probably just because overgrazing is something that happens through time. And this means that plants are exposed to grazing for too long a period. So imagine putting a group of animals into a confined pasture for a certain amount of time. They, like you at a salad bar, have preferences, and they will continue to go back to their favorite foods time after time if we let them. So we shouldn't let animals stay in one confined place for more than 7 days. But we see very often that horses and other animals are left in one pasture for a long period, what's called continuous grazing, and they continue to go back to their favorite things. Um, they don't get moved out of there, so the favorite plants get grazed down, they get weakened, and they get killed. Okay, so grazing a plant before it can recover from that first grazing uh, is a part of the overgrazing problem. Anything less than 2 weeks or about 14 days is too short a recovery period. Plants can't reestablish the roots and the shoots that they've lost from a grazing uh, adequately enough. Usually the recovery periods should be 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, depending on precipitation and temperature that allows the plant to regrow. So the most palatable plants get grazed repeatedly in an overgrazing situation, eventually killing them. So the productivity of the forages and the biodiversity both suffer. A real healthy environment, according to an ecologist, someone who studies ecosystems, is an environment that has many different species. So our pastures can provide a great diversity of things to eat if there are many different organisms in the environment. And that's both above and below the soil surface. Overgrazing leads to spread of undesired plant species, those that can tolerate being overgrazed. They tend to be annual weedy type grasses. So when you see those really short pastures, those aren't the species that were probably planted there originally. So I'm showing this same photograph that I showed before, but blown up a bit and with some definite points on what's going on there. So overgrazing provides this very, very short forage. You might see animals grazing there all day long and you think, oh, well, they must like it because they're continuing to eat it. Well, they don't have any other choice. Excuse me. So we see the tall, unpalatable weeds. You may not have realized that this is prone to erosion, but without a taller, more vigorous plant cover, water rushing over that surface after a hard rain would carry away some of the soil and its organic matter. Strong winds could initially dry out the surface, and again, there's not much covering the surface, so some soil could get blown away. We've got the reduced biodiversity of forages here, and very little forage for bite. So this requires many hours of grazing in order to fill their bellies and get enough nutrients. And as I mentioned before, overgrazing is very common in a continuous grazing situation where animals just have one pasture to go to and they spend the whole grazing season there. A grazing manager can do continuous grazing well if they have the ability to put more animals on when the forage productivity is high and take animals off when the forage productivity is low. But that doesn't happen very often. Here's another picture of an overgrazed situation. So again, you can see very short grass over much of it. In the foreground, you can see some taller forages. There's also clumps of manure in there. And this is part of a situation that's referred to as horse latrines on pasture. Again, it happens generally in overgrazed situations. Horses have started defecating in an area that had fairly reasonable forage, but another horse doesn't want to come and graze near that pile of manure. So an area that looks like reasonable forage develops, but when you look closer, there are clumps of manure in there that repels other animals from coming in, and other horses specifically from coming in and grazing there. At this point, I want you to think about a situation. Imagine a field of berries, and you're allowed to go into that field of berries because it's the only source of food you've got. And day after day, you're only allowed access to a small patch of it. You can see the whole field, but I want you to think about what's going to happen in there. Are you going to be able to eat those berries all season long? Or are they going to run out eventually? And how are you going to feel as your feed source starts to disappear? And you can probably see over a fence in the distance that it looks like there's some other berries out there that you wouldn't mind having. Maybe you'll put some pressure on the fences. I wonder what will happen to your body condition score. Okay, I'm going to move on now and just finish up with overgrazing. I feel sorry for horses on overgrazed pastures, which means that I often feel sorry for horses when I'm driving around the countryside. So I mentioned the size of a forage bite earlier, and I probably over-exaggerated the size of a bite. Yeah, 5 grams of forage dry matter. So not the wet as is when it's grazing, but if you dried that down, and dry matter is only about 20% of the total live matter of a plant. But we have a tremendous range here. So a horse that's in an overgrazing situation can probably only get around 0.5 gram of dry matter per bite, but one that's in a situation of plants in the right stage of maturity and height can probably get as much as 5 grams of dry matter in a bite. So as bite size declines, the bite rate has to increase so the horse can satisfy its hunger and its need for nutrients. So the shorter the grass, the smaller the bite, and the more hours a day the horse has to graze. So it's a situation that leads to frustration. Now I'm going to talk about a slightly different situation, that of undergrazing. it's not exactly the opposite of overgrazing, because it's not time that's an important factor here. If we have too few animals to utilize the forage in an area, we have what's called undergrazing. And what this is caused by usually is that the place is understocked. There's too few animals per acre for the season. So for the size of the forage resource, there's too few animals to eat it. So plants have an opportunity to grow very long and to mature. Okay, so these animals are going to graze a few of their favorite plants, and they're going to ignore plants that they don't like. So both palatable and non-palatable plants are going to become mature and reproduce, and they're going to get very tall. That's part of the maturity. So as a result, there's not enough beneficial effects of grazing on the plants. I hadn't mentioned this before, but grazing does have beneficial effects to plants. Any of you who have worked in horticulture a bit and done any pruning, or you know of this idea of a green thumb, where people will use their thumb and finger to pinch off buds of plants, the result of that is to cause branching. And we get plants with more branches so they can be fuller, and there's more forage dry matter produced. The trampling effect that's mentioned in this point relates to recycling some of those nutrients back into the soil. So some of the grazed material, some of the plants that are grazed are also trampled by animals. And the trampling puts part of the plant in contact with soil microorganisms, and they can recycle those nutrients and organic matter. So it helps in soil conservation. So with undergrazing, we get less of that. And here's a picture of a typically undergrazed field. It does have some temporary electric fencing in it, but obviously there haven't been enough animals in there to be eating that down. Some of that is older material. It's even gone brown instead of green, and those plants have gone to seed.
So at this point, we have another poll and question that I will launch.
Okay.
So as you're traveling the countryside, have you seen more overgrazed or undergrazed pastures?
I imagine you don't need very long to think about this. I'd be surprised if any of you actually say that you see more undergrazed pastures than overgrazed. If you think you're seeing lots of tall fields, it might be that those are hay fields rather than pastures. So overgrazing is far more common than undergrazing. So if you have an overgrazing situation, what can you do about it? You can implement a situation that I highly recommend that's called rotational grazing, in which you divide up your whole pasture into a number of smaller segments and graze them at reasonable stocking intensities so that you're avoiding overgrazing. You're providing animals with plants in the ideal stage of maturity and yield for short periods of time, and then they get to spend most of their time in a resting and regrowing situation. If the situation is undergrazing, then you need to bring in some more animals. If you don't want to own any more animals, perhaps you can rent out some of that pasture so that someone else's animals can graze it, and you can make a little money from that rent. Or you could cut that forage for hay. Let's move on now. So let's avoid both overgrazing and undergrazing. I've just mentioned some of the ways we can do that. I want to point out what's in that photograph. There's someone using what's called a grazing stick. It's kind of like a yardstick or meter stick, in that it has graduations on it so you can measure the height of forages, and then there's other information on it that helps you to actually estimate the yield of forage and how much forage dry matter there is per acre. I have a few of these grazing sticks. I got them all from colleagues in the United States. I'm not sure we have any available in Canada yet, but there are other ways we can estimate forage yield, and we'll get to that later. So we can measure forage dry matter yield. That's what FDM stands for. We can estimate the weight of horses. And if you've taken a nutrition course, you may have learned of a method you can use with a tape measure to estimate weights of horses. Of course, if you have a livestock scale, you can actually measure horse weights accurately. So by knowing horse weights, we can calculate their forage dry matter yields. It's usually somewhere around 2 or 2.5% of their body weight per day. We do a little arithmetic, and that can help us budget the supply of feed available per paddock and correspond that to the horse's needs. If you're in a situation where you're feeding hay, hopefully you have some idea how many bales of hay you need to get your horses through a winter. You can count the number of bales, you can calculate the average weight of the bales, and use that as part of your budgeting process. Likewise, we can do these estimates that help us budget our feed supply while grazing. A bad situation is that there simply isn't enough feed for the number of animals because there's too little land for the number of horses we've got to look after. I can see this at some horse boarding establishments. Simply, there are too many horses for the amount of land that's owned. Now, this situation in this photograph is a little artificial. I think this is probably a corral run by the Bureau of Land Management in the United States, where they round up wild horses. I don't think the intent is to keep them there very long. So how can we solve the too little land issue? Well, we can buy some more land or rent some, which may be more affordable. Hopefully that land has good soil. It can produce a high yield of forages. It's got effective fences. If it doesn't already, with the purchase of some temporary electric fence, you can make a big difference. It should have an adequate supply of good quality water. And you can also supply that at moderate cost. If we've got too little land, reduce the horse numbers. I know if you're in the business of boarding, that's a hard thing to do because you need the income from every boarder. Maybe you can improve the productivity of some of the land or change the use of some hayland into pasture. It's quite fine to run some temporary electric fence through parts of a hayfield and graze that. So what I'd recommend if you're into that sort of situation is use the temporary fence to increase the number of paddocks and use rotational grazing. So if you're thinking you might try that, I've mentioned something about the length of time horses or any grazing animal should be on a particular piece of land. Let's imagine at first that you're dealing with something like just short grasses, like Kentucky bluegrass, a common grass in most people's lawn. There might be some white clover in it, maybe a little bit of creeping red fescue. So this is what I'm referring to as a general short forage type. You should start grazing that when it's about 10 to 15 centimeters tall or 4 to 6 inches tall, and stop grazing it when it's about half that height. So 5 to 8 centimeters or 2 to 3 inches. These types of forage can handle being grazed down that short. The more typical forage species, tall plants that you would see in hay fields like timothy, brome, orchard grass, tall fescue, and the legumes alfalfa and red clover, these should typically be started in grazing at about 20 to 25 centimeters or 8 to 10 inches and grazed down to half that height, 10 to 12 and a half centimeters or 4 to 5 inches. If you're in a place where someone's been growing ryegrass, perennial or Italian ryegrass, those heights are in between the recommendations for the short and the tall. Now, I don't imagine many of you carry a ruler around with you or a pasture stick, but maybe you have some idea if you've just taken a ruler out when you put your boots on and got an idea where 8 or 10 inches is on your boots, or where 2 or 3 inches is on your boots. And you have some rough indication then, as you're walking through the field, how tall that forage is. Then I want you to think about what else you could do to get some rough idea if the pasture is tall enough to put animals into a field or to take them out. I got thinking about this a few years ago and as an exercise for some of my students, and I came up with this idea just for the purposes of illustration. You might think it's kind of wacky, but I went out to my colleague's farm with her. She had some thoroughbreds out there, and she allowed me to put some colored tape around her horse's legs. So I put this blue tape 30 centimeters above the ground. And that indicates to me that if the forage was that high, that would be pretty mature forage. It's starting to lose palatability. It should have been grazed earlier if the intent was to graze it at all. Maybe it would be better to let that forage go a little taller still and be turned into hay. The red bands of plastic tape around the horse's legs there are at 20 centimeters. So that would be just right to start grazing most common forage species. And the yellow tape there is at 10 centimeters above the soil, and that's the height at which you should be removing horses. Now you see the grass that horse is standing in. While that is part of a pasture, it's a relatively unmanaged pasture, and that's in a period of drought. So that forage has not grown well at all that year. That's a fairly exceptional situation, and animals certainly shouldn't be grazing forage that looks like that. So in this picture, you can see one of the grazing sticks or pasture sticks that I mentioned. So here are 1-inch graduations coming up on this pasture stick. And some of the information here indicates that what the forage dry matter yield will be at these different heights. And that would be, forage dry matter per inch per acre, given these heights. The fact that there's 3 columns of information there would be for forage that is quite sparse, or forage that has moderate density, or forage of very high density. This forage density would be considered high. 2 other implements that we've got there. We see a piece of square acrylic or lucite. It's got a hole in the middle where you can put this grazing stick. And what that allows you to do with these two things in common, or using them together, it provides a uniform amount of compression of the forage. And the reason that one of my colleagues from Virginia started doing this was he realized that if you just take the measuring stick and put it in some tall grass, it's difficult to assess what the average height is. But if it's uniformly compressed with a sheet like this, then it's more reliable and more repeatable. So he called this thing a falling plate meter, and he's done quite a bit of research with it, written a lot of articles about it. I know they're not very common, but I was able to make one myself with just some leftover materials I found around. He has articles in which he describes this. His name is Ed Rayburn, and if you're ever searching articles on forage yield, you might come up with articles by Ed Rayburn on his falling plate meter. This other thing is something that's much more expensive. It's a few $100s. It's called a rising plate meter. And this aluminum plate of a particular weight and diameter will rise up as you push this sort of cane portion down into the forage all the way to the ground. And the number of half-centimeter clicks that the plate rises up will cause this little counter here to indicate what the approximate forage dry matter yield is. So while I was still working at the University of Guelph in the Kemptville campus, I had one of these. It should be in Guelph somewhere, I think probably with Dr. Katrina Merkes. So you might think, all right, I can make some small paddocks, but how can we make sure we do these short grazing and long resting periods? I mentioned grazing the height from, let's say 20 centimeters down to 10. And that follows this rule of thumb called take half and leave half. All the leaves, remember, are photosynthesizing. They're making sugars, which the plant can either store as an energy source or they can turn into new growing material. So we don't want to deprive the plant of a whole lot, more than half of its solar panel for photosynthesizing. That's why the recommendation is just graze half the height. Watch the animals. See when they are actively grazing, get an idea of how much of the day they're having to graze, and watch the plant heights. Do what you have to do to know when the forage is half grazed. The type of plants that the animals will want to graze are leafy, fast growing. They shouldn't have flower heads or seed heads yet. Make sure we provide enough area per animal, and I'll show you some figures shortly to help you with this part. And make sure we have enough paddocks to rest the plants until they've recovered fully. Okay, so these 5 points are really the basics of a rotational grazing system. Now, you might think, well, taking only half the forage, isn't that kind of inefficient? Isn't that wasting? It's not really wasting, because that plant that's left with half its leaf area is able to recover faster than one that's only got a quarter of its previous leaf area. And another thing that happens is that as you graze a plant really short, it starts to lose some of its roots. So let's look at some other points here, okay? As the plant height is decreased, the root length also decreases, particularly when we graze it very short. That rate of shrinkage of roots is really increasing when we graze more than half the height of the plant. Marjorie, we have a slide order problem.
Yep, just a second.
There we go. That's better. So bigger roots means faster growth of the leaves. Okay, more root material means more water and mineral nutrients can be brought into the plant. If we have more residual leaf height left, it also prevents overheating of the soil. And the soil contains a lot of desirable microbes and other little creatures like earthworms and manure beetles that are very beneficial in the environment. So that's why we should stop the animals grazing when the height gets down to about half the original. So here's a diagram that, that shows what happens to root growth. This grass on the left has been grazed to just half its height, and there's no detrimental effect to the roots. Notice how long those roots are relative to that half height. So they're probably as long as the original height of the forage. If we've grazed that forage down to 70%, by 70% to only 30% of its original height, some of those roots have stopped growing for more than 2 weeks. And if you graze it really short to like by 90%, those roots have absolutely, all of them, stopped growing for a considerable length of time. And that delays the regrowth of the shoots and means it's going to be a long time before you have a grazable amount of forage again. So let's do what we can to prevent really poor quality forage. Give it the opportunity to be great again. Now, as plants mature, their nutritional quality declines, and animals will decrease their voluntary dry matter intake. If you ever see a growth curve of a plant, I'm sorry I don't have a slide of one here, but the steepest part, that is very rapid growth per day or per hour, that's the sort of phase of plant physiology when we want those plants grazed, okay? And before they start to flower or set seed. We should test our soils. And if we think we have real serious problems after the soil test, then perhaps even test plant tissue for nutrient deficiencies. When you send a soil sample to a testing lab, they'll ask for a certain amount of information, including what you intend to do with the soil, what you intend to have growing there, and what sort of yield you expect. Horses that have particular problems, like those that are chronically obese, that have laminitis or are prone to laminitis, that have been identified as having equine metabolic syndrome, should have their forage intake restricted because a number of forages are fairly high in non-structural carbohydrates. That is, sugars and starches and things called fructans. So with horses like that, we can provide them with shorter grazing times, so don't let them graze all day long, and we can put grazing muzzles on them to restrict their intake per hour or per day. Thankfully, the percentage of horses that have these problems is low, but we do need to provide for those horses in that situation. One lady that my sister rides with near Calgary has what she calls a Jenny Craig paddock for those horses that are in this sort of situation. And it provides relatively little grass for them to eat. Weeds are often a problem in pastures, and there's many different species of weeds. it's a good idea for you to acquire a resource so that you can learn to identify some of them. One of the resources that I like is a little book from Quebec called Weeds of Quebec. I thought, oh yeah, there it is. Here's this book, Weeds of Quebec. I don't know if you can see it very well, Marjorie.
If you tilt it a little forward,
Yeah,
yeah, there we go.
it has an ISBN number, so you can look that one up. It's a very convenient size, lots of good color pictures. So that's good for an Ontario situation. Just about every provincial or US state extension service or agricultural ministry has publications to help you identify weeds and also help you identify toxic plants. So learn to identify the predominant weeds in your area and whether they like to grow on your drier areas or your wetter areas, shadier areas or sunny areas. Learn a little about their biology so you can do something about where they grow. In general, we'll find that if you've got good pasture management, your weeds problems decline as your management abilities improve. If we restrict grazing periods to 5 days or less, I don't even like to go to the 7 days maximum that's recommended. You'll find that the weeds don't handle that sort of management very well compared to the desired forages. Extend your rest periods longer. Okay, so shorter grazing periods, longer rest periods will contribute to fewer weeds. And ensure that you've got your paddocks sized so that within 5 days, you are fairly uniformly grazing that forage down to half its height. And the rest periods are appropriate to allow those forages to get up to the recommended start grazing heights. Now you might find if you're doing these two things for a while that you're getting some surplus forage, and that's fine. Let some of those paddocks get up to a height where you think it's suitable to cut them for hay. And if you don't have the hay equipment yourself, hire someone to come in and make hay of that surplus. Use a sensible stocking rate. In most places, we need at least 2 acres for a 1,000-pound horse, and we'll give you some more specifics on that shortly. I'm going to be defining stocking rate and stocking density very shortly. One way we can express stocking density is in terms of pounds of animal. So we should probably have at least 10,000 pounds of animal per acre and up. So that would mean about 10 animals per acre at any one time. So here's a really simple rotational grazing system. This has just 4 paddocks. There are gates that allow you to move animals from one paddock to another. There's an alleyway here that has a loafing shed or a bit of shelter where they can get out of the weather. It has a pond that can supply drinking water, although that's not always the best source in terms of quality. Notice that it is fenced so that animals can't get right up to it and into it. Hopefully you'd be pumping water out of a pond to troughs in every paddock. This is an aerial photo of a more realistic situation, perhaps. There's a variety of paddocks with different sizes and shapes, and you can define them with fences. Ideally, you should provide a drinking water source in every one of them. A disadvantage of having these different sizes and shapes is that it's less predictable how long you're going to need animals in any one. And the stocking density is going to be different if you've got the same number of horses moving throughout all these. Stocking density is different in this big one than it is in a smaller one. Each rotational grazing system should also have a sacrifice paddock or an exercise paddock for bad weather. So when it's really wet and the soil is soggy, we want a place to put horses and feed them hay. We don't want to count on a paddock like this for a source of feed. Yes, there'll probably be some weedy material that grows there and animals will graze it, but that's not what we're depending on for their diet. We have fairly high stocking density in a sacrifice or exercise paddock. So less concern for forage quality and quantity. Use it with wet, soft soil. So now I'll define these terms stocking rate and stocking density. The stocking rate is the number of horses per acre for a whole grazing season. Wherever you live, you might know when you can typically get animals on pasture and when you should take them off. As you improve your management, you should be able to extend your stocking rate. You should be able to extend your grazing season. Let's say you're starting at about 120 days, and with better management, you may get it up to 150 days. The stocking density is the number of horses per acre at one point in time. So if we're moving them out of a very large paddock, same number of horses to a smaller paddock, the stocking density is going to increase. High stocking density allows us to put this pressure on the forage base in a paddock so that the animals will graze it fairly uniformly. There'll be some competitiveness to get to the better forages, and it'll get grazed fairly uniformly if we have an adequate stocking density. So you can express this as acres per horse. If you had really high productivity, it could be horses per acre. We can also express it as pounds of animal per acre, as I did in an earlier slide. 10,000 pounds per animal is not all that excessive. With cattle, I have read of a case where someone actually got up to 100,000 pounds of animal per acre. That would only be for a few hours. I want to help you work with these things, stocking rate and stocking density. So I've provided some scenarios here, and we'll do a little bit of arithmetic to help you be comfortable with them. So let's imagine a continuous grazing situation where we've got 2 horses in every paddock, where we've created 5 paddocks within a larger pasture. So we've got 10 horses. In this situation, they're spread out. This continuous grazing is probably going to lead to overgrazing. But the stocking rate is 10 animals over 10 acres, which equals 1. The stocking density is also 10 animals over 10 acres, which equals 1. If we're going to graze rotationally, we're going to put all animals in one paddock, one 2-acre paddock at a time for 5 or 6 days. And in that case, our stocking rate is 10 animals over 10 acres equals 1. But our stocking density is different. It's 10 animals over only 2 acres, which will give us 5. Now I'm going to provide an opportunity to look at typical stocking rates for a number of different scenarios. If we have just an exercise paddock where we're not expecting the horses to eat much, we need 1/4 of an acre per horse or less. If we've got small ponies and we've got reasonably good pasture, it's weedless and fertilized, they might need 1/2 an acre to 1 acre each for the grazing season. If we've got riding horses of approximately 1,000 pounds and they have 3 or 4 paddocks grazed rotationally, if there's not much rainfall, you might need 4 acres per horse. If there's high rainfall and high forage productivity, you might get away with 1.5 acres per horse. And if we have draft horses, perhaps 2.5 to 5 acres per horse. So these are fairly typical. It doesn't necessarily mean that any one of these numbers or ranges is exactly what you're going to need on your particular horse farm. We can calculate what's a reasonable stocking rate. So acres per horse. Now, my slide has got a little bit perverted here. This part, days, this should be over here, grazing days. So it should be average horse weight in pounds times 0.04, representing 4% of body weight per day, times grazing days, divided by average forage dry matter yield in pounds per acre. So an Alberta publication has given me these numbers to put into that formula. 1,100 pound horses. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that probably about 2.5 or 2.5% of body weight per day is the amount of forage dry matter you should be feeding or allowing them to graze. But since we're talking about take half and leave half of the forage, we double that. So this represents 4% of body weight per head per day. And a grazing season, in this case, we're using 140 days as an example. And then for a forage dry matter yield in pounds per acre, this is what they already knew was from haying, that they got about 2,000 pounds per acre. That's not all that productive. But using these numbers, we would come up with about 3 acres would be needed per horse for the whole season. So now we'll go on and look at some other situations, again, based on Alberta conditions. So where they had very little annual precipitation, only 10 to 14 inches of rain and or snow equivalent for the whole year, if the pasture was excellent, they still needed 8.5 acres to support a horse, because this low rainfall will mean very low forage production. Where the pastures were not quite so good, they needed 12 acres to support a horse, and where the pasture was really poor or thin in terms of its density, they'd need 25 acres to get a horse through a season. With a little better precipitation, 14 to 18 inches in a year, we see these figures are a little lower. So you need a little less land to get a horse through a grazing season. At 18 to 22 inches, which is typical of the area where I grew up in Manitoba, if the pasture is excellent, you still need 3 acres per horse. If it's poor, you'd need 8.5 acres per horse. And this is getting closer to Ontario conditions at 22 to 26 inches. Some years we'd probably anywhere from Guelph to Ottawa areas, we'd probably have 30 inches of rain. 2 acres of excellent pasture would support a horse. 5.5 acres would be needed on poor pasture to support a horse for a year, or sorry, for a grazing season. The next question here is, well, how many paddocks do I need? Well, we have a simple formula for this as well. And that is your required rest period for plants to regrow that half of their height, divided by the grazing period in days, and add 1 more. So that's a pretty simple formula. And here are some examples that you can work on your own. Imagine we've got rest periods of 36 days, and we're going to be grazing them approximately 6 days. That's what it will take them to graze the forage down to half its height, and add 1 to that. I'll do the first one for you. That's 36 divided by 6 is 6, and add 1 more, and that answer is 7. So in that sort of situation, you should have at least 7 paddocks. Okay, these are minimums. And you can go through the rest of these yourself. In drier conditions, you're going to need longer rest periods. And as you increase your number of paddocks, you can shorten your grazing periods and also make the paddocks a little smaller for more flexibility in your management. So that's what I have in terms of information for you. Marjorie probably has some other comments she wants to provide. And my last slide is some references to further reading.
Yeah,
So
thank you, Paul. One of the final questions of the live webinar was about references. So here are the 2 references you've used and recommended. Are there any other ones that you would recommend?
I highly recommend a couple of things just on grazing management. They don't actually have many articles on horses, but one of them is the Stockman Grass Farmer. That's a little newsprint thing that comes out of Missouri every month, the Stockman Grass Farmer. You can Google that. I think their subscription is $56 a year. I find it my favorite agricultural publication. And then an online one that comes out weekly is called onpasture.com. And that has lots of very short articles, really practical. It's a real growing publication.
Excellent. I want to thank you so much for sharing your information with students of the Equine Studies program and those who have joined us as new horse owners. This is a re-recording, as we mentioned at the beginning. It's a little longer than our live webinar, but I think you will find it's, again, full of so much information that you can use to create a better pasture. So thank you, Paul, for coming and sharing.
You're very welcome.
One final thing I'd like to mention is where you can find more information about our program. So again, this webinar has been sponsored by Equine Guelph and Open Learning and Educational Support at the University of Guelph. We have a fully online certificate and diploma program that has equine science and business courses. They're designed for the whole horse owner and practical, applicable, science-based information that you can immediately apply to create better pastures, better health for your horses, and with an emphasis on welfare. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for watching the webinar recording. We will have another webinar posted in the next couple of weeks. So if you are in the coaching or training field and are thinking about moving your training online, Tracy Dobko will be talking about online coaching, how to do it, what to keep in mind, and how to get your business started with that opportunity. So thank you again for everyone coming. Thank you, Paul. And
you're very welcome.
That brings us to the end.